everything lost is meant to be found.
Right, stand by for rehearsal, guys. Stand by.
Let's go.
Dry for wet sequence in the film is where we have an underwater sequence where Angelina, Lara, is going down to the lunar temple, which is beneath the sea. To get down there, her and her two friends go on these weird underwater bikes. And obviously, logistically, taking Angelina and the actors underwater was always going to prove a bit of a problem. So Steve Begg, the visual effects supervisor, came up with this, trying to do it dry for wet, where you recreate the look as if it is underwater, but actually you're not, you're on a stage.
The sequence opens with a real wet for wet start, but unfortunately we found out that the bikes were a bit ungainly, so we were lucky at like 30 takes to get one good take where one or other of the bikes didn't suddenly careen out of control. So I think we actually saved them a hell of a lot of aggro by going with the dry for wet approach.
I know the stunt boys had some games trying to make those work. The first time I really had time to play with those in the water was in Greece, so 2 weeks before we were shooting.
I had a feeling using this, which is basically an old-fashioned technique where you smoke up a stage and you light it appropriately so it looks like an underwater environment. And I thought using the older techniques and allying it with CGI, we could create a convincing underwater environment. So very early on, in fact, before we had a director appointed, I shot a test to convince everyone that it could be done. We managed to get a small rocky set and some real wet bikes, cut the propellers off them, suspended them on wires and basically flew them through this smoky environment. And the producers bought it, and it became a major sequence in the opening of the film.
You have two switches. One is for your fan blades on the right side, and the left side is for the lights. So many layers in that shot. It's like massive, but they all add up to this incredible new environment, which I think looks incredibly real.
Okay, reset. Lights off. Fans off.
When you shoot really underwater, it never looks like really underwater. And I always had problems with that. You never can put fish in. Fish, the moment you're underwater with a camera, fish are gone. Forget about the fish. The water gets very, very blurry, and you barely can see the actors.
Chris Corbell and his guys basically created 3 overhead tracks on one of the stages at Pinewood using computer-controlled winches. They then flew these bikes across the stage with the actors on board. And then with, as I say, a smoky, a foggy type environment, we basically shot them as if they were actually underwater.
It was like being on a ride, and it feels like you've got your own amusement park. But at the same time, I think it was painful, mainly for the boys.
The footage is then cut. It was then given to the effects house, and their primary job was to, first of all, remove the wires convincingly, which was a task in itself, and then apply to the image using track technology all sorts of elements that you see in an underwater environment, such as seaweed, particulate matter, and fish. And the real deal was getting the mix just right, so it didn't look too contrived.
And I think that the whole underwater sequence, as it is put together now, it looks more underwater than you can possibly imagine, because you see all the things that you imagine to see there. You could never, ever do that in a real tank.
After the sequence in the lunar temple, she has to escape from the collapsing structure. She then encounters a shark that had stalked her early in the sequence. And being Lara Croft, she karate punches it in the nose, stuns it, and then hitches a ride using its dorsal fin to the surface. Because she was free floating, this couldn't be done using the dry for wet techniques. It had to be shot in a contained blue screen underwater environment, and we were lucky to have a 60 by 40 tank constructed for us. She was actually pulled through the water using, once again, one of Chris Corbell's wire rigs. And we had a rough dorsal fin shape, which towed her and a stunt double through water, which we then replaced with a CG shark.
I was thinking about something a little faster.
The other major visual effects sequence is where she basically uses a stealth re-entry pod.
Of course, you wouldn't be Lara Croft. You wouldn't get there in any normal way. He has to get there fast. And he made it this incredible trip that he dropped a pod from outer space.
This we realized primarily with CG effects. The environments were actually quite interesting, that the Chinese environments she crashes in, as they were actually shot in Wales.
The pod crashes into a cliff and then does this classic sort of Donald Campbell, Bluebird crash and wipe out. Interesting shot because almost the entire shot is digital. We have digital map painting, surrounds, digital water. The only elements that really actually are live action are these splash elements here. We fire these big chunks of metal into the water. It's the most fun I've had in a day for ages, and you can be left with one last bit in there. They seem to match up with the animation so well. So the last time you see the pod before it finally vanishes is actually a live action lump of car that we fired into the paddock tank.
The Shadow Guardians are these supernatural monster characters that inhabit this primeval petrified forest that surrounds the last tomb. And they're basically one of the final barriers you have to go through.
It's a continuation of a sequence that we shot in Africa in a place called Hell's Gate. And you come through a gorge and turn a corner, and then you're onto the stage.
The petrified forest was another huge sequence, and we needed a whole bond stage for that, which is one of the biggest stages in the world.
We're now in what they call the petrified forest, and that's on what they call the James Bond stage. And that seems huge, and it's just all these trees. And it has been completely petrified, and it's a huge space.
To create like a forest that looks real and that is at the same time feels like it's petrified, all the trees had to be man-made, handmade by an artist to really make it look like real trees, like real petrified plastic. And it really looks like you come into a very strange, surreal world where the Shadow Guardians might live, and where everything is always moving. There's nothing, nothing is what it seems it is.
It's an amazing place, specifically built to support the stunt, to support the special effect, to give the shooting company a method in which to pull off an incredible sequence with a lot of technologies involved.
So you have to really know exactly what you're going to do with the visual effects in mind. That whole idea of the moving lights, it's like, that was a big job. It's like how I always can create shadows all the time, non-stop in the set. A lot of them are real shadows that we created by having this enormous tracks of lights that through every scene, every shot kept moving, throughout the set. But then that would have to match the visual effects later, because those shadows, that's ultimately where the Shadow Guardians come out of.
These trees back here are all digitally map painted, and so we had to adding additional shadows in there to keep the movement flowing through the whole painting.
And so we had to make it in a way that it would feel very natural that those creatures would come out of it, and that this shadow actually, so that when the creatures come out and they would move back in the tree, the shadow just continues. It is just another part.
They start for shadows, and there's this point where they have to go from being a flat moving shadow on the surface to being sort of leaping out.
These characters are realized entirely using CG. We had basically nothing on the set to represent them for various reasons, but all the interaction and what have you with the various soldiers coordinated by Simon Crane using various wire rigs and what have you, yanking the stuntmen around the set. Later on in post, we animated the characters in sync with, or in sympathy with, the various background actions. And I think ultimately the sequence is quite dynamic.
It's got a variety of elements to it, like sometimes the Shadow Warriors or Guardians, as they're now called, are just shadows, so you don't notice them, and they're just very subtle, creeping through shots. And sometimes there's nothing, there's a little bit of dust might fall off. So all we had to do is add a live action element to a live action play, and the days weren't so CG labor intensive. And other shots, you've got a full, big, 100% physical monster, full screen, dripping dust and cold breath and stabbing actors.
It's relatively dark, but when you see a glimpse of it, it's like really scary like hell. And it has like massive power. It's like it lifts you up and throws you against the wall like you're paper.
Holy shit!
I think that the production designer and the whole visual effects crew and we did a fantastic job in achieving this and making it look so real.
We go from the dry for wet sequence, which is underwater, to the lunar temple destruction, which is a huge interior, to a wet for wet shark ride in a tank environment where she's recovered by a submarine, which is a CG environment, to Fringe of Space, where she drops down using this re-entry vehicle into China. And then into Africa with the various matte paintings and petrified forests and various creatures that she encounters there. Quite a broad spectrum of unusual sets and environments that we had to add our visual effects to.